They say neighborhoods are built on fences and friendly smiles. But behind every manicured lawn, every HOA sign, every perfectly trimmed hedge, sometimes lurks something far uglier: control, fear, and exclusion. This isn't just a story about a dog, or a boy, or a fence. It's about what happens when power is abused, and how one father, one blind teen, and one loyal guide dog sparked a revolution. I've spent my life interpreting the law from the bench, but nothing could prepare me for what unfolded in my own front yard. Because when the system that's meant to protect turns against the vulnerable, the real courtroom might just be your street. This is the story of how a community broke, and how we put it back together, one step, one voice, and one act of courage at a time. If you'd asked me a year ago where I saw myself by now, the answer wouldn't have been here, standing on the porch of a quiet house in Silverwood Bluffs, Colorado, watching my blind teenage son take his first independent walk through the neighborhood with his guide dog. But life has a way of rewriting plans. When my wife died in the same car crash that took my son's sight, something inside both of us fractured. I wasn't just grieving the love of my life. I was learning how to raise a child who could no longer see the world the way he once did. Ryan was 16, awkward, smart, a lover of football and tinkering with gadgets. After the accident, he didn't want to leave his room. For a long time, he didn't even want to speak. Then came Atlas. Golden coat, intelligent eyes, a quiet presence that somehow managed to bring calm back into our lives. Atlas wasn't just a dog. He became Ryan's independence, his confidence, his light in a world that had gone dark. After months of therapy, mobility training, and countless hours of learning to navigate the world again, Ryan finally stood tall enough to say, "Dad, I think I'm ready." I watched him now, hand gripping the harness, Atlas moving with practiced precision beside him as they rounded the block. He looked steady, not like the boy who once trembled stepping off a curb. For the first time in months, I let myself breathe. We'd moved here to start over. Silverwood Bluffs was quiet, clean, surrounded by evergreens and sunshine. The HOA brochure used words like peaceful, safe, and family-focused. It was supposed to be the kind of place where neighbors smiled, kids played, and everyone looked out for each other. I bought the promise, signed the papers, and kept one thing to myself: my job. After 20 years on the federal bench, I'd learned it's better to live like an ordinary man. I didn't need to be addressed as Your Honor. I just wanted to be Ryan's dad. 3 days after that first walk, I found an envelope on our doorstep. No postage, just a typed notice and a red stamp that said violation. Unauthorized animal on premises. Fine, $750. Immediate removal required. My hand trembled, not from confusion, but from something far more dangerous. Righteous anger, not courtroom anger, fatherly anger. I had filed enough civil rights rulings to know exactly what this was. But before I reached for the gavel, or the phone, I reached for grace. I scheduled an emergency meeting with the HOA board. I came prepared. ADA documents, Atlas's federally issued guide dog certification, Ryan's medical proof, the full package. I wanted this to be a misunderstanding, a fluke, something we could clear up with a conversation. Margaret Monroe had other plans. She sat at the center of the HOA board table, like a queen at court. Late 50s, ironed blouse, a necklace shaped like a starburst, bright, sharp, and cold. The others flanked her like well-trained knights, nodding, flipping pages, avoiding eye contact. Margaret gave the papers one disinterested glance before pushing them back toward me with perfectly manicured nails. "Mr. Langston, we appreciate your situation," she said, in that tone people use when they don't mean it at all. "But this is a community of standards. We've had residents express concern." "Concern?" I asked. Ryan sat beside me, quiet but alert. Atlas lay curled at his feet, still and calm as ever. "Some people find disabilities unsettling," Margaret said, choosing her words with surgical precision. The visibility of it all. The dog. The harness. It's disruptive. I blinked. Federal law protects my son's right to have a guide dog. Margaret smiled. This isn't a federal court, Mr. Langston. This is a private community with rules. It's Judge Langston, muttered one of the board members, finally recognizing me. Margaret's eyes flickered, but her smile didn't fade. Your title has no weight here, she said. You may be used to making decisions, but this isn't your courtroom. Perhaps there are more appropriate communities for families with special needs. I stared at her. Hard, long. I could have flipped that table. I could have quoted statute after statute. But Ryan was sitting beside me, and I wasn't about to give her the satisfaction of seeing me crack. As we stood to leave, Ryan whispered, "Why do they hate Atlas?" I wanted to say it wasn't hate, that it was fear or ignorance, but I couldn't lie to him. Not after everything he'd been through. It's not Atlas they hate, I said softly. It's that he reminds them of the truth. They don't want to see what doesn't fit their picture. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I stayed up reviewing the HOA bylaws, making notes, reviewing state and federal ADA precedent. The fire inside me, the one I used to carry into every courtroom, was back. I had tried to be a good neighbor. I had tried to let things go. But Margaret Monroe had just turned my son's dog into a target. And that meant war was coming. It started with the lawn signs. Subtle at first. Support our neighborhood standards, printed in neat cursive, posted outside 3 or 4 homes near ours. Then came the petitions, barely masked attempts to rally against exception clauses that could undermine the integrity of Silverwood. The language was always just vague enough to seem legal, but clear enough to make their target obvious. They didn't say Ryan's name. They didn't need to. He noticed, though. Every step outside, every trip with Atlas, became a performance under judgmental stares and shutter-click glances. Neighbors who once smiled now closed their doors a little faster. Kids he'd said hi to no longer waved back. "I don't think they want me here," he said one night, his voice barely audible beneath the hum of his computer screen. I looked up from my paperwork. "You're not the problem, Ryan." He didn't answer. Instead, he reached down and touched Atlas's head like it was a grounding rod, keeping him tethered to something sane. But the next blow didn't come from the neighbors. It came from the HOA, again. A formal letter. This time, certified. Signed by Margaret Monroe, effective immediately. All animals residing in Silverwood Bluffs must be registered with a DNA sample for tracking purposes. All service animals must wear muzzles in shared spaces. Monthly verification of medical necessity will be required for continued residence with a service animal. Noncompliance will result in escalating fines and civil enforcement proceedings. No reference to the ADA, no exemptions, no humanity. I placed the letter down slowly and exhaled. "She's not trying to regulate dogs," I murmured. "She's trying to drive us out." Ryan didn't say a word, just left the room and shut the door behind him. That evening, a group of teenagers gathered near our sidewalk. Half of them from Ryan's school, the other half, kids I'd seen at the community pool. One of them dared to bark, not laugh, not joke. A sharp, mocking bark. Atlas stood alert. Ryan froze. The group scattered with laughter trailing behind them like smoke. Later that night, I found Ryan on the back porch, curled on the swing with Atlas nestled beside him. "I used to think it was just about the rules," he said. "Now I think they just want to pretend people like me don't exist." I sat down beside him. "They want quiet," I replied, "but not peace. There's a difference." He turned his face slightly toward mine, the porch light casting soft shadows across his jaw. "Do you ever wish I hadn't made it through the accident?" The words hit me like a body blow. I didn't speak. I couldn't. He kept going. "Sometimes I think it would have been easier. For you, for me, for them." I grabbed his hand. "You listen to me, Ryan. That night, I didn't just lose your mom. I almost lost you. And every day since, I've watched you fight. That dog doesn't just help you walk. He helps you keep going. And these people, with their rules and their fake smiles, they don't get to take that away from you." His chin trembled, but he nodded once. I stood. "It's time we stop asking for fairness," I said, "and start demanding justice." That weekend, I reached out to 3 people: a civil rights attorney, a local disability advocate who'd fought for school access rights, and my old friend Gloria, a retired DOJ colleague turned ADA litigator. I told them everything, every letter, every whisper, every moment Margaret Monroe tried to weaponize policy against my son's existence. I wasn't just gathering information anymore. I was building a case. And Margaret? She was still smiling, still sipping Chardonnay on her porch like she had already won. But she didn't know the law was coming for her. And I knew exactly how to wield it. If Margaret had sensed we were preparing for a legal fight, she didn't show it. Instead, she escalated, quietly, calculatedly. It began with a notice of compliance review, a dense, 6-page packet, citing over a dozen potential violations of HOA code at our property. Improper hedging, solar lighting positioned at incorrect angles, mailbox paint, 1 shade off regulation beige. But nestled among them, strategically placed, was the heart of her attack. Violation 11B. Failure to submit monthly proof of medically required service animal usage. Fine, $500. Deadline, immediate. "This is harassment," I told my attorney, James Adler, during our meeting that Monday. He nodded. "She's hiding behind HOA technicalities, but make no mistake, this is targeted. She's trying to drown you in paperwork until you either pay, move, or break." "I won't do any of those," I said. He smiled grimly. "Good, because we're about to hit back." Together, we filed a preliminary injunction in federal court, citing violations of the Fair Housing Act, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. James drafted a blistering brief that accused the HOA of weaponizing regulations against a disabled minor in an orchestrated campaign of exclusion. But we didn't go public. Not yet. I wanted her to underestimate me. I wanted her to think I was still just a widowed father trying to play nice. So, when the next violation arrived, unsanctioned lawn ornament, Ryan's wind chime, I smiled and filed it away. When she called a surprise HOA meeting to reaffirm community standards, I showed up, sat in the back, and said nothing. And when she introduced a vote to implement a quiet hours policy, clearly aimed at limiting Atlas's access to evening training walks, I simply raised my hand and voted no. She thought I was stalling. What she didn't know was that I was giving her rope, and she was hanging herself with it. Meanwhile, Ryan was struggling. The attacks had turned personal. Notes began appearing in our mailbox, typed, unsigned. "You're not wanted here. Maybe if your dog was smarter, you wouldn't have crashed in the first place." "This isn't a school for the blind." He didn't tell me at first. I found them under his bed, crumpled into a shoebox, hidden beneath socks he never wore. "I didn't want to make it worse," he whispered when I confronted him. "Worse?" I asked. "They're threatening you." "I didn't want you to feel like you were failing again." That stopped me. "Again," I repeated. He bit his lip. "I know you blame yourself for Mom's accident, for me going blind. But it wasn't your fault, Dad. It wasn't." I swallowed hard. "I don't blame myself," I said quietly. "I blame the world that treats you like you're broken." And then I made him a promise. I'm going to fix what I can, right here, starting with them. The next day, Margaret sent animal control, again. This time, they brought a city officer. The accusation? A resident dog had defecated on common ground, without removal. Of course, the timestamp on the HOA photo coincided exactly with the time Ryan was in his mobility class, 30 miles away. The officer was apologetic, but firm. "We have to file an incident report." "Good," I said, "because I've got one to file too." I handed him a folder. Inside, documents from the preliminary injunction, time-stamped GPS data from Atlas's training harness, and a formal request to investigate false reporting and abusive process. He read silently. She knew this wasn't real. "She made it personal," I said. "Now it's going to be public." That weekend, I attended the HOA monthly open session. I walked in alone. Margaret was already holding court, seated like a queen at the front of the rec center, sipping tea as neighbors filed in. "Ah, Mr. Bennett," she said, her smile all teeth. "Here to file another grievance?" I smiled back, calm. "No, just here to watch the show." I handed a stack of sealed manila envelopes to her assistant. One for each board member. Each envelope contained a courtesy copy of the lawsuit filed in federal district court. Benjamin Bennett and Ryan Bennett versus Silverwood Bluffs, HOA, Margaret Monroe, et al. The room froze. Margaret's eyes skimmed the headline. Then her color drained. "This is absurd," she hissed. "You're suing us?" "No," I corrected gently. "I'm suing you." She looked at me like I had just ripped the facade off her soul. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Then I turned and walked out. As I reached the door, I heard someone clap, then another. A third joined. By the time I stepped into the night, the room behind me was half applause, half confusion. The lines had been drawn, and this time, we were no longer alone. The lawsuit hit Silverwood Bluffs like a thunderclap. By the following Monday, whispers had turned to full-blown debates. Front lawns became discussion circles. Next-door threads exploded with speculation. But while most neighbors were still processing, some began stepping forward. The first was Carla Nguyen, a second-grade teacher who lived 2 houses down. She knocked quietly one morning with a tray of homemade muffins and, something more important, a folder. Inside were 3 years' worth of fines, all issued by the HOA, all targeting non-white, non-retired, or non-traditional families. "My husband always said to stay quiet," she admitted. "But after what they did to your son, I can't be silent anymore." The second was Mr. Ellison, a Korean War vet whose ramp had been forcibly removed under aesthetic guidelines. When I invited him to give a statement for the case, he paused and said, "I was told my service in war earned me a place in any neighborhood. Margaret told me my walker ruined the curb appeal." By the end of the week, we had over a dozen residents ready to testify about systemic discrimination, weaponized citations, and board manipulation. My attorney, James, called me with a simple sentence. "Ben, this isn't just a lawsuit anymore, it's becoming a movement." Meanwhile, Margaret was losing her grip. At first, she doubled down, sent out HOA-wide emails claiming I was a radical trying to destroy community harmony. She called emergency meetings, each thinner in attendance than the last. She tried rallying board support, but one by one, they peeled away. When her treasurer, David Larrabee, publicly resigned citing ethical disagreements, it was clear the dam had cracked. But Margaret still had one move left, and she made it count. She filed a counterclaim, accusing me of slander, disruption of HOA operations, and, most cruelly, emotional exploitation of my son's condition for legal gain. It was venom on paper. James showed it to me with his lips pursed. "She's trying to get public sympathy back, paint you as the villain, that you're weaponizing Ryan's blindness." I stared at the document. "She wants me to break," I said. But she didn't understand something critical. I'd already broken. The day I sat next to my son in the ER after the accident, holding his hand as they told us the damage was irreversible, I shattered that day. What Margaret was doing now wasn't breaking me. It was rebuilding me. Things escalated when local media picked up the story. It started as a quiet column in the city blog. "Blind teen service dog targeted by HOA. Family files federal suit." Then a bigger outlet followed with a headline Margaret hated. Justice in the suburbs. Judge takes on HOA alleged discrimination. They hadn't even used my current title. But once federal judge was in the subheading, the silence shattered. Reporters showed up at Silverwood gates. Residents were asked questions during their evening walks. Someone even flew a drone over the community clubhouse and leaked video of Margaret's impromptu crisis meeting. The power dynamic shifted overnight. People who'd once looked away when Ryan passed now waved. Some knocked, some emailed, some cried when they told their stories. But the most unexpected came from the children. Ryan came home one afternoon, voice shaky. They built a new bench at the park, he said, with Braille on the back. What does it say? He swallowed hard, smiling through tears. This bench sees everyone. I went to see it myself. Neighbors had painted it soft blue. Etched along the seat were raised letters in English and Braille. At the corner, a tiny paw print, and the name, Atlas. I had no words. Only the unshakable clarity that this neighborhood was changing, and Margaret had no idea how to stop it. But behind the scenes, she was scheming. We received a subpoena from her lawyer requesting access to Ryan's entire medical history. James nearly tore the paper in half. This is low, even for her. She wants to rattle us, I said. Let her try. Then came the anonymous tip. A former HOA board assistant sent an untraceable email with attachments, minutes, from a closed-door meeting Margaret held 3 months ago. The file names said enough. Agenda exclude Bennett.pdf. Compliance tactics /Q4 PPT. Liability mitigations on disabled residents.docx. Inside were chilling statements. Guide animals are liabilities. If we create enough compliance pressure, they'll leave voluntarily. Visual disability impacts buyer psychology. James sat back in his chair after reading. This isn't HOA overreach anymore, it's civil conspiracy. That night, I tucked Ryan into bed, his hand resting on Atlas's head. He whispered, "Do you think they'll leave us alone now?" I looked at him, stronger than he knew, stronger than they'd ever expect. "No," I said softly, "but they'll never touch you again." The courtroom was packed. What began as a quiet neighborhood feud had transformed into a high-profile federal civil rights case. Media trucks lined the sidewalk. Reporters scribbled notes. A line of neighbors stood outside the courthouse, murmuring under their breath as they waited for a seat inside. Inside the courtroom, I sat at the plaintiff's table beside James, my attorney. Ryan was at home with a trusted neighbor, Atlas, by his side. He wanted to come, but I couldn't bear the thought of him hearing what they might say about him in open court. Across the aisle sat Margaret Wilson, her jaw locked tight, expression unreadable. Her attorney shuffled papers nervously, sensing what was coming. Behind her sat 3 remaining board members. Only one dared make eye contact with me. The case was about far more than a dog now. It was about systemic exclusion, targeted harassment, and the moral rot that hides behind bureaucracy. As the judge entered and proceedings began, I felt the strange weight of irony settle on my shoulders. After years on the bench, I was now the one seeking justice. James opened powerfully, his voice measured and clear. This case is about a blind child who was stripped of his legal protections in the place he should have felt safest, his own neighborhood. It's about an HOA that decided federal law was optional. It's about prejudice dressed up as policy. And today, that ends. But Margaret's lawyer countered with manufactured concern. The HOA was merely enforcing community standards. There was no malicious intent, only a desire to maintain uniformity and safety. I clenched my fists under the table. Safety. Uniformity. Words that had been twisted into weapons. Then, the witnesses began. Carla Nguyen took the stand first. Her voice shook at first, but strengthened with every word. I was fined $1,000 for having potted herbs on my porch. But when I asked why my neighbor had the same thing and no violations, I was told, some homes just get more attention. Mr. Ellison followed. He described how his request for a ramp was denied 3 times before he finally gave up and stopped attending Sunday dinners with his grandchildren. Each testimony painted the same picture, a pattern. A pattern of intimidation, of selective enforcement, of silencing voices that didn't fit the Silverwood Bluffs mold. But the turning point came with the final piece of evidence. James handed the judge a flash drive containing audio files, recordings from board meetings we had obtained legally through discovery. The courtroom went silent as the speakers played Margaret's voice. These people come in and expect us to change everything for them. It's always accommodation this, service that. It's exhausting. If they can't follow our rules, maybe they should live somewhere more suited to their lifestyle. The silence that followed was suffocating. Even her own lawyer closed his eyes. That's when the judge, a sharp and no-nonsense woman in her 60s, leaned forward. "Counsel," she said, "am I to understand that the HOA knowingly implemented policies designed to pressure protected residents into leaving?" Margaret's lawyer stammered, "Your Honor, we believe the context was misrepresented." The judge raised a hand. "Save it for closing." That night, Silverwood Bluffs was quiet. Too quiet. Word had spread like wildfire. Some residents were horrified, some defensive, some emboldened. But one thing was clear. The line had been drawn. The next morning, something changed. Anonymous letters were slipped under doors. Some residents, fearing being associated with Margaret, began submitting affidavits to distance themselves. Others approached me directly with apologies. Then, an unexpected knock at my door. It was Janine Rivera, a longtime board member who had voted to fine Ryan for unauthorized public presence at the pool. She held a folder in her hand and wouldn't meet my eyes. "I came to return something," she said quietly, placing the folder on my kitchen counter. Inside were copies of every board vote, emails between members, internal memos, but the final page stopped me cold. It was a draft resolution, never sent to the HOA mailing list, titled, "Guidelines for Preserving Community Identity and Reducing Disruptive Influences." It proposed a system of points that would be used to track homeowners who were deemed non-compliant or visually disruptive, including those who had more than 2 visitors under 18 per week, displayed religious symbols not approved by the board, required medical or disability-related accommodations. I stared at it in disbelief. "This never passed," Janine whispered, "but it was real. Margaret wrote it." I folded the document slowly, rage boiling just beneath my calm. "She was building a caste system," I said, "and the whole community was the test site." Janine nodded, then left without another word. The final court date was set. A ruling would come soon after. But before that, we had one final surprise. James revealed that the Department of Justice had launched an independent investigation, citing the ADA and Fair Housing Act violations. If found liable, the HOA could be dissolved, its board members barred from serving on future associations, and heavy fines imposed. The HOA held a panic meeting that night. Margaret never showed. Rumor had it she'd fled to stay with family out of state. Cowardice wrapped in Chanel. The courthouse was unusually still the morning of the verdict. It had been nearly 6 months since that day on my front lawn, when my blind son was forced to reach into empty air, crying for the dog that had never once left his side. 6 months since Margaret Wilson tried to erase us with bylaws and bureaucracy. Now, the system she manipulated was about to deliver judgment, not just in law, but in truth. Michael insisted on coming with me that day. He stood tall beside me in his neatly pressed blazer, one hand on Cooper's harness, the other loosely gripping mine. "You sure?" I asked. He nodded once. "They need to see who they tried to erase." In the courtroom, the air buzzed with quiet tension. The judge entered, her black robe flowing, expression firm and unreadable. I watched as Margaret, pale and tight-jawed, sat at the defense table, her lawyer frantically flipping through final motions, hoping to buy time, find an angle, anything. But time had run out. The judge began. After reviewing extensive documentation, testimony, and audio recordings, it is the court's finding that the Silverwood Bluffs Homeowners Association, under the direction of Margaret Wilson and select board members, engaged in deliberate, targeted harassment in violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act and the Fair Housing Act. A gasp rippled through the courtroom. Michael's hand trembled against mine. This court is issuing a cease and desist order effective immediately. All discriminatory HOA policies are void. A federal fine of $150,000 is levied against the HOA, with additional damages awarded to the plaintiffs. Furthermore, the Department of Justice investigation will proceed. Margaret's face collapsed. Her carefully constructed composure shattered. She opened her mouth to speak, but the judge wasn't finished. And to Mr. and Michael Carter, I offer not just legal remedy, but this court's deepest regret that your rights were denied so egregiously within the very community meant to shelter you. Let today serve as a reminder. Justice delayed is not justice denied. Silence. And then, applause. Not from everyone, but enough. Enough to feel like a tide had finally turned. As we walked out of that courtroom, neighbors stood waiting. Not with glares or cameras this time, but with apologies, handshakes. A mother held her son's hand and said quietly to him, "This is Ryan, he's brave." A former board member, once silent, stepped forward and said, "We didn't speak up, but we will now." Outside, the sun was shining. Birds were chirping like nothing had ever gone wrong. But something profound had changed. Not just in the neighborhood, in me. I turned to Michael. "You did this," I said quietly. "You never stopped being brave, even when they tried to make you feel small." He smiled, just slightly. "You taught me how." That evening, the Silverwood Bluffs Community Center overflowed. Not with board members, but with residents, real neighbors. Young, old, black, white, disabled, immigrant, religious, secular. For the first time, they weren't meeting to impose regulations or file complaints. They were rebuilding. Mrs. Patel brought tea and samosas. Mr. Rivera handed out flyers for a new neighborhood watch that didn't involve surveillance cameras, but actual human eyes and hearts. A teenager with autism shared his poem. A mother cried softly in the back row. They voted to dissolve the existing HOA leadership. A community inclusion charter was drafted. Real conversations began about what safety, respect, and belonging actually meant. Michael and Cooper, they were named honorary community ambassadors. He received a standing ovation when he stepped to the mic and said, "I don't want anyone else to feel like I did, so I'm staying, because I belong here." Yeah. In the weeks that followed, property values rose. But more importantly, so did spirits. Children played freely again. Older residents stopped hiding. Neighbors brought each other groceries. A mural was painted near the clubhouse with a single message: "Justice lives here now." Margaret? She quietly sold her home. The board members who stayed resigned without protest. Her real estate license was suspended pending investigation into discriminatory practices. She left in silence. And yet, this wasn't her story anymore. It was ours. A story about how one boy and his dog reminded an entire neighborhood of what real community means. A story about a father who refused to let the law be bent into a weapon. A story that didn't end with revenge, but with restoration. On a quiet Sunday, I sat on our porch, coffee in hand. Michael and Cooper passed by on their morning walk. A group of children tagging along, asking questions about guide dogs, laughing, Mrs. Davidson waved from her rose garden. Mr. Ellison rolled by on his new ramp smiling. Music played softly from a backyard barbecue nearby. This was what we fought for. Not just peace, but purpose. Not just victory, but belonging. The world may not always be kind, but in this little corner of it, we had created something real. And that was justice.